So tonight we want to talk about scene. We want to talk about new perspectives on the world and how we as designers have a very unique perspective on the world because we are creative people. And I think if there's one thing that I would love for us to take away tonight, it's that we as designers have this perspective, and the way that we see the world is important. Because the way we see the world is different, and the moments that we choose to look at, the moments that we choose to pay attention to, actually matter. And so our role as designers is not just about building really wonderful, beautiful, delightful, usable products, but what we look at and how we interpret the world actually gives us hugely valuable perspectives in how we build those products and how we make those decisions and how we make those things actually be delightful and more usable. And I think in this regard, Ferris Bueller has some pretty great advice for us because being a designer and making those connections, building products and services that start conversations, that connect people around the world, actually has a huge amount to do with paying attention. And I think this art of paying attention, because it is an art, is something that's really undervalued in our field. I think oftentimes we kind of push that to research, and we say, oh, research, it's your job to go out and observe, it's your job to go out and gather all this stuff, and then come back and tell us what you have found. But I think we really need to ask the question of ourselves as designers, what does it mean for a designer to pay attention? What does it mean for a designer to go out into the world and look at things and come back with our own insights about the world and how we build products that are different than anybody else? Because I think there's such a great push to build these amazing things, to go out and build, design beautiful products, to impress, delight, and dazzle, that we become so heads down in the next best things, whether that's our projects, our phones, our screens, these little pieces of glass in front of our face, that we forget that really, 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 really good things come also from just stopping and slowing down and looking up and noticing the things around us. I was reading this New Yorker article a couple months ago about how our brain processes connection. And it was really interesting because essentially it said that our brains have this natural inclination to pay attention to things in our environment that are different. And I thought this article was wonderful for a whole host of different reasons, but I thought there was one fault with this article, and that this article assumed that we pay attention to begin with. And so what I want to do for the next 20 minutes or so is I don't want to talk about tech. I know that might disappoint some of you. I don't want to talk about product design. I actually want to talk about something totally different. I actually want to tell you 3 stories that capture my attention. And these are stories that have influenced my work as a designer. These are stories that have caused me to kind of take notice of things. They're stories that teach me about people. They're stories that teach me about interaction. They're stories that teach me about how people connect within their environments. And my hope is that by stopping and looking at some of these other things, we'll actually end up with some new reference points to kind of bring in to our work as designers. So that's kind of where I'm headed tonight. So I want to kind of dive right in and start with my first story. It's simply titled Pad Thai. And one of the other things that you need to know about me, aside from the things that Dave mentioned, is that I have an insatiable love of travel. I will buy plane tickets to like random places in the world just to like put my foot on the ground and then fly back. And in 2009, I was laid off from my job, and instead of rushing out and trying to find another job designing wonderful things, I actually bought a plane ticket and traveled for a year. And I spent 3 of those months in Southeast Asia. And I traveled by myself. I traveled alone. And I love this experience because I was traveling alone, I had, and you might have this experience as well, because I was traveling alone, you have all of these like crazy opportunities to talk to people like halfway around the world in these places that you will never go again, and meet these people that you will never talk to ever again, in these most random places that you will never go again. And so I remember one of these conversations particularly. I was waiting for a train in this little border town on the border of Thailand and Laos. And I stopped in at this little roadside restaurant, and I went in and I sat down, and I had one of the best pad thais I have ever had in my whole entire life. And I struck up the conversation with the owner of this restaurant. She was a woman in her mid-30s, and she told me that she ran this restaurant with her father, who was just sitting right over there with the one other person that was in this little restaurant. And we talked about the train schedule. Because I was a traveler, she obviously wanted to know where I was from and where I was going and where I had been. She was really interested in this idea that I was really far away from home. And she was trying to wrap her head around the fact that I was really far away from my family, something that she had a really hard time kind of connecting with because her father was literally right there all the time. And she was so excited that I had ordered pad thai because it was her absolute favorite dish on the menu. The one thing that she would have told me to order, I ordered. She was thrilled about this. And so we talked about celebrity gossip, and we talked about the possibility of riots breaking out in Bangkok, and we talked about all this random stuff. And by this time, you're saying, Erin, this is the most boring story ever. Why are you telling me this? This is small talk in this crazy restaurant. This is so boring. And I would have to tell you that this conversation was perhaps the most interesting conversation I had in my 3 months in Asia, because this woman didn't speak a word of English, and I didn't speak a word of Thai. Other than our typical formalities of hello, thank you, how are you, we shared 2 common words, and those words were pad thai. And those 2 words actually became the reference point from which our entire conversation started. And so over the course of an hour, I sat in her restaurant and we connected. We didn't connect with words, but we connected with gestures, hand waving, pointing, magazine pictures, drawings. And through these signals, we were able to have a conversation. Because we could point to something in our environment and have a common understanding of what that thing was, we could begin to develop a shared language around a whole host of other things as well. And I think it shouldn't surprise us that now more than ever, verbal exchange is not the most important thing when it comes to a good conversation or making connections with other people. Every day, we are able to access people halfway around the world through simple gestures and references to things in our environment. And these universal gestures are just the first step in creating a language within our product environments and within our office environments that everyone can interact with. And these gestures and these languages have a huge, huge impact on how we connect with people. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves as designers, can someone access this language? Can someone understand these gestures? How do they use these languages to navigate around their environment? Are these gestures and are these languages consistent with our users' expectations of how they should react and behave and respond? And ultimately, do these gestures create a pathway for us to access somebody that we might have never met before? And so I think my first story is really about this idea that we make connections when we can point to things in our environment and use them as reference points. And this is really lucky for us because the whole internet is built off a foundation of pointers to references. And so I think this first story reminds me that gestures and actions and shared languages actually do, in some cases, speak louder than the words we actually use. But I think there's a problem with this, as anything. A lot of the products and services and conversations that we have don't actually provide good reference points. And if they do provide good reference points, we actually don't possess the language to know how to access them. And so I think for us as designers, it's important to have good references because they help us connect and navigate an environment. Which brings me to my second story. Because when I think about connecting and navigating environments, I actually think about going to the art museum. I don't think about tech. My background is actually not in tech. My background is not in product design. I studied fine art with an emphasis in creative writing. I grew up, I hated computers. I was terrified of them. I remember the first time I had to use Photoshop, I cried. It's true. I grew up, I loved the arts. I grew up taking art classes. I ended up going to an art museum. I ended up going to an art school that was literally connected to an art museum. And because it was cold in Chicago where I went to school, I would cut through the museum every day to walk to class. And as I walked through the museum each day, it gave me time to pay attention. And what I noticed as I walked through the museum was something very different than what I noticed in each of my classes every day. What I noticed when I walked through the museum was that there were people that came to this museum. They came to this environment to experience really amazing things. I mean, you watch these people walk through the door, and they were so excited. They're like, yeah, we're going to see some amazing art. But then they got in, and they looked around, and they were not in any way equipped with the proper language, the proper history or the proper reference points to actually access or understand this environment that they had just put themselves into. And they didn't realize that everything that they were seeing in that museum, hanging on the walls or on sculpture stands or wherever, was an important and even groundbreaking expression of somebody's personal experience. And so they would just wander around aimlessly, gallery to gallery, just kind of walking around, hanging out. And they didn't put these pieces together to realize that paintings actually didn't always hang on a museum wall. Paintings used to hang in meeting halls or in warehouses, or they were painted on church ceilings or stacked in corners of artist studios. And paintings, before there was TVs and screens and newspapers and all of these things, paintings were the things in people's environments that they could point to, things that they could look at and talk about. And they could look at these artifacts in their environment and they could make connections. And they could use these artifacts to understand each other, to understand their relationships, to understand their environments, to understand their different kind of places in the world. And so while my classmates were just down the hall kind of fawning over the latest artist exhibition or museum lecture or something, I would actually go to the museum for hours and hours and hours on end just to watch the people. And I was captivated by this idea that artwork created these meaningful and really incredibly groundbreaking connections, but that these connections were completely lost and completely altered by the fact that paintings were now hanging out of time and out of space in this museum environment. And there was little to nothing that took all of these data points that were hanging in the museum and bring them back into a story. And I was so frustrated by this. It just pissed me off. Because when I looked at these paintings, I had this just incredibly delightful experience with the work of art. And I was so pissed off that museums had created this environment where so many things lived, but where really nothing belonged. And I was frustrated that museums had created this environment and were doing such a horrible job of helping people interpret gestures. They were doing a really horrible job of helping people make connections and understand relationships between figures. And this is something that's not, you don't have to look very hard to see. I mean, I don't know if you've ever watched somebody like walk into an art gallery, maybe this is you, right? Or somebody that walks into an art museum. Like, people are so intimidated by the interfaces that they don't understand. They don't have the right questions to ask, they don't have the right tools to answer. And so as a result, you hear a lot of the same conversations happening in art museums. Gosh, my second grader could have made that. God, I mean, come on, why is this in here? This is dumb. And when I was in art school, there were so many of my classmates that kind of like got all up in arms about these stupid people that were walking into these museums and they just didn't understand. But I would actually look at these people and say, like, awesome, good for you. You're trying to make this connection, and it's not actually your fault that you don't have the language to access these things. Because what they were trying to do by comparing the work they saw on the wall with their second graders painting on their refrigerators, they were trying to make this personal. They were trying to make this experience personal to them. And they were trying to kind of connect the dots in ways that they couldn't figure out how to do. And so what they were doing is while they were in the museum environment, they really tried to seek out all of these other reference points to try and piece together why this thing was here, what it was for, and what the hell they were supposed to do next. And this was really hard for them. And it made this experience that they walked into expecting to be so delighted by really just frustrating and horrible. But there actually was one thing that was hanging on the museum walls that people paid attention to. And those were the labels. And I thought this was really amazing because the more I kind of spent time in the museum watching people, you'd see people walk around. And they kind of develop this pattern of behavior where they walk into the gallery and they kind of look around and be like, oh my God, I don't know what's here. And they go straight to the label on the wall and they would read it. And after hours and hours of watching this, I actually ended up doing my final project on a piece that kind of focused on these labels because the labels were the designed artifacts that we put into our museum environments that, for better or worse, help people understand how to respond. They help people know how to interact in this environment. And these labels in that environment were a different kind of interface. And this this really kind of broke my heart because ultimately these interfaces in the museum were the ones that mattered to people. These were the interfaces that kind of reduced this amazing emotional, expressive experience into an intellectual exercise. One of my advisors during school called these kind of labels and other things in our museum environments, he called them exhibition prosthetics. And we called it this because labels and these other kinds of prosthetics were substitutes in the museum environment for something that was missing or defective. Labels were kind of this like artificial augmentation or connection to something that should be very naturally alive. And so my fascination with these exhibition prosthetics extended to things like wall text, pamphlets, information booths, audio tours, replicas. And they were all of the things that wanted to belong in this very artistic, emotional art museum experience, but were completely and totally divorced from it. But they fascinated me because these prosthetics were actually the things that people paid attention to. And they paid attention because they were accessible. And they spoke a language that everyone could understand. And so as designers, I don't think it should surprise us that we actually deal with labels all the time. We spend our entire day devising systems of visual and verbal cues that we put into our digital product environments that help people know how to interact. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, are we providing meaningful reference points? Or are the labels and reference points we give people just a prosthetic or some kind of poor expression for something that is missing from an experience that should be very naturally alive? Because ultimately, what people want is not the label. People don't give a shit about labels. What they care about is an experience with meaningful stuff. They care about the connections. They care about a personal interaction with something in the environment. And so as designers, we need to understand that labels are important, but we need to learn how to surface labels that are relevant in our product environments, placing them when and where and how people need them the most, and integrating them into a meaningful experience rather than kind of just tacking them on. And so we need to really ask, what is meaningful? Making something meaningful is about the timing, about when they see the label. It's about the perspective, who sees it and how they see it and when they see it, and how does somebody actually understand that. And so if delightful labels kind of help us to connect with an environment, then it's really important to understand those connections. Because, again, people don't remember labels. They don't care about the data points. People pay attention to moments that matter. And people pay attention to these moments because they create a story of their experience. So my last story is actually about explorers. Alongside travel, I am fascinated by early explorers. I think more than any other kind of historical character or character in our modern history, explorers are the people that just like capture my imagination. And they give us they give me this new way to understand how people connect with their environments. And here's what I mean by that. If you think about it, explorers really give us great perspective on how we experience our world today, because here we are in the 21st century, and we have all of the information we need at our fingertips. We have mounds and piles of data, more than we know what to do with, about how the world works and how the world operates and what we need to do in it. We have information about distant planets and microorganisms and everything in between. But there they were back in, many, many centuries ago. And they weren't even sure if the world was round. And they weren't even sure if the surface they were sailing on would suddenly and literally drop off of the face of the earth. And so to me, it is mind-boggling to try to figure out how they came up with ways to connect and how they came up with ways to propel themselves into relationships and into new environments. Because they couldn't use cell phones. They couldn't just plug in some coordinates into their local GPS and end up at a nearby island for a barbecue. They didn't have any labels to lead the way. And so what did they do? And I think what's fascinating to me is that early explorers really mastered the art of paying attention. They used reference points in the sea and in the sky to find their way, and they used these reference points as signposts of the natural world to connect their island with another island across this vast expanse of sea. And so what they would do is some of these early explorers, especially the ocean navigators, they would actually look at the color of the clouds that they were sailing underneath. And based on the color of the clouds above them, they could determine where the reefs were situated below them. And by determining where the reefs were, they could tell where land masses were. And they could use those signals to kind of position themselves in this kind of vast expanse of ocean. And from these reference points, they created maps. And these maps told very unique stories. And these stories helped them orient, navigate, and connect. This is actually a Micronesian navigational chart. It's made up of sticks that are cut from the pandanus tree, and they're tied with string of the hibiscus bark. And these sticks in the Micronesian maps normally represent three things: wave patterns, ocean swells, and currents. And the islanders, Micronesian islanders, they would actually tie shells, nodes, at strategic locations. And essentially what these nodes were is these nodes were pinned spots that a navigator wanted to remember. And so unlike our European maps that kind of strove to build these universal routes based on accurate measurements, each of these Micronesian navigational charts was different. And it was a very unique expression of an individual's personal experience. And so what this meant was that two navigators from the very same island or the very same school might devise two dissimilar stick charts for the exact same route, because each of those navigators would wish to remind himself of different aspects of the course. And so their references, the things that they pointed to, shifted based on their personal experience. And the conversation they ended up having with each other was way more than just the words that they used. The conversation they ended up having was way more than just a series of right and left-hand turns that ended up bringing them from one point to another. I would say that the Micronesians were the first people that made tools that talk back. And these tools and these maps told a story that was an expression of their personal experience and shared experience. And so what these maps actually mean in the places that they actually refer to, we have no idea. They're a mystery to us, because those stories were shared only within very tight communities of people. But I think what's fascinating about these maps and other maps is that this behavior, this tendency to look at data points in the world around them, in an environment, and create stories, ends up being a pretty universal behavior with explorers throughout time. And it shouldn't surprise us that the sea was not the only place that people went looking for stories, because cultures around the world and throughout time have stopped and looked up, paid attention to the sky, collected data, and identified signals. And by looking at the sky, we are able to recognize patterns and interpret movements. We're able to make connections between the most recognizable points. And once these early explorers made those connections, they were actually able to turn those connections into stories. And these stories, not surprisingly, help them orient themselves, navigate, and connect with their world. And so whether these stories were based on the sky or the tides, when put together, they formed an entire system of how they experienced their world. And so the sea and the sky were these constantly updating interfaces whose reference points kind of turned and changed based on an explorer's location, based on their relationship to land masses, and these interfaces were kind of the foundation that drew them into new experiences, because again, they didn't have any way to understand their world. And so they took this system and kind of created their own set of ways to understand that. And so I think, we make our own sorts of constellations in what we do today. And we're not like the explorers in the fact that we're connecting things and information, but we're actually connecting people and relationships, and that becomes really powerful. And it is through these relationships that we start to understand our own experiences. And so I think, again, we start to make connections when we're able to respond to reference points in our environment. And like the explorers, we make our best connections when we look up and respond and pay attention. Because ultimately, we have to remember that design is a conversation. It's not just this kind of like solitary exercise. And it's a conversation that gives us the appropriate gestures. It gives us delightful labels. It gives us these data points to kind of chart connections between people and their everyday environments. And so as designers, it's our responsibility to be storytellers, and it's our responsibility to be communicators. Because again, people don't remember data points. They don't care. Data points are important for us to build those stories, but ultimately for the people that we're designing for, it doesn't matter. And so it's our job as designers to pay attention, to listen to the stories that people tell us, and to build products that talk back, and to build products that reflect people's experiences. And so we do this by taking those data points and making them relevant, and giving people things that they can point to, things that they can interact with, and above all, things that give them connections to the things that matter most. So I think actually we have to go back exactly to where we started and say that life actually does move very fast. And if we don't stop, we will miss it. And so I think as designers, we need to start paying better attention. First, we need to understand gestures, and we need to build shared languages because they let us point to references. And we have to have good references because those references help us to connect with our environments. And finally, we have to understand those connections and understand those environments because ultimately the stories that we tell and the relationships that we build really matter. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Thanks so much for being here.